Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today, those of you in the room and those of you joining via the web. I'm Jennifer Walsh. I'm a Senior Media Officer with the Institute of Medicine, and we're here to release our new IOM report, Sharing Clinical Data, Maximizing Benefits and Minimizing Risks. The report is now available, and it can be downloaded for free, along with related materials at www.iom.edu/data sharing. Now, this will be a one-hour briefing unless we run out of questions beforehand, and we will start off with some opening remarks to introduce the study and then go over an overview of the report's recommendations. We'll then open it up to questions from the floor and those from the web. And those of you in the room, if you have a question, you're asked to go to the microphones. There's one in the middle and one on the side of the room. And those on the web, there is a area to click to submit a question right below the video player. Just click on there, type in your email address, and then you can submit a question. And I ask if you do have a question, please put your name and your affiliation before typing in your question. So with that, let me introduce Dr. Victor Zhao, President of the Institute of Medicine.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good afternoon. It's great to see so many people here, and I mean it, because I think this is such an important report. I'm just happy to welcome all of you to this report release, Sharing Clinical Trial Data, Maximizing Benefit and Minimizing Risk. So today, we see unprecedented opportunity to advance the world's health. We have incredible tools for science, drug development, healthcare delivery, and public health. We have access to an incredible wealth of data, and we've hardly begun to tap into the knowledge that it can elucidate. Also, methodological improvements in how we collect, manage, analyze, and share data have vastly improved our ability to evaluate new therapies and others. So as our approach to managing information evolves, we must be prepared to responsibly respond to these changes to ensure that we are using data ethically and to its full potential. Now, sharing clinical data has many potential benefits. It would allow other investigators to carry out additional analysis and reproduce published results. It will strengthen the evidence base for regulatory and clinical decisions. Sharing will increase scientific knowledge and stimulate new ideas for research, and it will maximize the contributions of participants and avoid unnecessary duplicative studies. With these benefits, there's much agreement that academia, industry, government, and private enterprises should collaborate and share their data in an open source fashion. Indeed, many scientists are already doing this, and technologies are being developed to make ethical sharing a reality. For example, the Global Alliance for Genomic and Health, G4GH, is developing application program interfaces that will facilitate the sharing of genomic and clinical data across disparate sources, giving researchers the information they need while maintaining patient anonymity. And many pharmaceutical companies are also sharing clinical data, for example, Project DataSphere and others. And generally, an open data movement is really gaining momentum. So, great opportunity, but still many people are still hesitant. We know this is not an easy topic. Change, I think we all believe is needed, but change is not always easy and comfortable. There are many disincentives to data sharing. Competition, loss of control over data, loss of credit, giving away trade secret, and so on and so forth. And of course, we need to develop a culture that supports data sharing, and we need to provide incentive and develop trust. But as this committee is going to present to you, we have to develop expectations, guidelines, and standards of how and when to share clinical data. Now, last November, HHS proposed a rule that would require the sharing of summary data from some clinical trials of FDA-regulated drugs and devices. NIH then built upon this to propose a policy around registration and results reporting all clinical trials funded by NIH only. So we're very, very pleased at IOM to have taken on this particularly important study to expand further some of the thinking on sharing clinical trial data. As you know, IOM provides a neutral forum to gather evidence and debate the best way forward. Convening and facilitating thoughtful and honest deliberations is what we do best. And I think the strength in this report, I think, is not only on the committee and the thoughtfulness of that and our staff, but also the fact that we have 23 sponsors who have the foresight and boldness to pave the way forward in data sharing. The sponsors include pharma and government, NIH, FDA, private foundations, US and international. So I'm really pleased to welcome you to release this report. Now this report is in your hands, we urge you to take these ideas forward as you're here and make sharing data a reality. The real work begins now. Let's collectively make an effort to disseminate these findings and encourage adoption of these recommendations. I have to say that it's amazing the committee and the staff has spent long hours on this not an easy topic. Certainly along the way, I've been watching in awe of their effort. The report provides guiding principles, operation considerations, and recommendation on data sharing for multiple types of stakeholders. I believe that this report will shed really much light on the rapidly forming path towards enhancing data sharing. So I'm very grateful. I want to have a chance to thank this incredible, strong committee for developing these recommendations. The chair, Dr. Bernie Lowe, of course, he's just led this committee so ably to get to where we are. And several members, Sharon Terry, Devan McGraw, and Ida Sim are here today. We want to thank all of you for your great work and for being here. And also, Joanne Wallstreicher is joining by phone, if I understand correctly. I want to thank all of you really for all the time you put into and the brain power of this very important piece of work. I also want to thank our dedicated staff who's moved the project forward. Without their leadership, insights, and research, it couldn't have been done. India Hook Bernard, who's here, Michelle Manker, and Ann Claiborne, Andy Pope, Elizabeth Cornett, Michael Berrios, Scott Halprin, and an IIM Anniversary Fellow who also make this work possible. So thank you again for allowing me to make this introduction, and I truly, like you, look forward to the conversation about this very important recommendation of this very important report. Thank you very much. Benny?
Thanks very much, Dr. Zhao, for the introduction and the kind words. As chair, I want to add my thanks to both the committee members, many of whom aren't present, and really to the IOM staff, without whom this report never could have happened. And this was a big, difficult report, and I think particularly India Hook Barnard and Michelle Mancher have really been stalwarts. I'm going to start by saying every one of us, everyone in this room, on the webinar, and also everyone in the population has an interest in responsible sharing of clinical trial data. We are all patients or future patients or relatives of patients. And we all really want to have the widest and most rigorous information about what therapies are effective and what their side effects are. We think responsible sharing of clinical trial data will foster that important public interest. Currently, much of the data collected in clinical trials is not analyzed and not published in peer-reviewed journals in a timely manner. Perhaps a third of clinical trials do not have the results published 4 years after the completion of the study. So all that effort, the contributions of the participants, the effort of the clinical trial staff, and also the financial funding for the trial go to naught if the results aren't published. We think responsible sharing of clinical trial data will advance the science that underlies as the foundation of good clinical care. And as Dr. Zhao mentioned, Sharing allows other investigators to independently try to reproduce published findings, carry out secondary analyses. It maximizes the contributions of participants and the effort and the funding for trials. We think that today the question is not whether you share clinical trial data, but instead what types of data do you share, when do you share it, and how do you share it? And we made very specific recommendations to specific actors to address these questions. Quickly, I'm going to say some more about the study context and background, discuss our conceptual framework, and then get to the recommendations. I will keep my formal presentation brief to allow time for questions, both from the people on the web and those in the room, and I'm going to call upon my colleagues here to answer those questions. There were a range of both public and private sponsors. Our committee, who I really thank, had diverse experience and expertise, and it was selected by IOM to have balance. And it went through the usual rigorous IOM peer review process. The charge to the committee was to describe the types of data from clinical trials that are being shared, when they are shared, and whether they're shared with or without restrictions. We're also charged with identifying the benefits, risks, and challenges for sharing of clinical trial data from the perspectives of different stakeholders. And it was really important to sort of separate out how different stakeholders had different concerns and interests. And finally, we were asked to make recommendations, which we did, and I'll go through, to enhance responsible sharing of clinical trial data. Now, I want to just take a minute to start with definitions. So by data sharing, we mean making data from a clinical trial available for secondary research. Data sharing need not be putting data up publicly on the web for anyone to download. Instead, it may be shared only after request and might be shared only with certain conditions of use. And in fact, we'll see as we make the specific recommendations how we think those elements of the conditions of use and other protections are important. I want to just stop for a minute about talking about data because it's been very much in the news, and we need to distinguish, first of all, sharing of results of clinical trials. That's already required. There are now, as Dr. Zhao mentioned, initiatives to broaden the requirements for sharing the results, the summary results. But we're really talking about something well beyond that. Not just the summary results, but much more data, which can be summary data, tables, charts, figures, clinical study reports prepared by companies presenting material to the FDA can run into thousands of pages of tables, charts, summary data. Beyond that, we also looked at sharing data on the level of individual participants. Now, this need not include identifiers, and we talk about how to protect privacy, but you can then go back to individual patient data, and that really enriches the secondary analyses that can be carried out. When we say data, we really want to emphasize that it's not just the data, it's metadata, which is trying to describe what the data are, how it was derived, plus the study protocol, all versions, plus the final version, the statistical analysis plan that the investigators used, and the actual analytic code, the computing code used to calculate the published results. We think all that is really needs to be shared to maximize the benefits. Okay, so key benefits, we've already heard something about. You can, other investigators can reproduce the published results, carry out additional analyses, strengthens the evidence base for clinical decisions and regulatory decisions, leads to new ideas for research, sort of hypothesis-generating studies. It increases the payback, the reward from the contributions of participants, and avoids unnecessarily duplicative trials. If you can access data from prior trials on similar study drugs, study interventions, you may redesign your trial, the next trial, in a way that avoids unnecessary burdens on participants. Now, we did articulate guiding principles, which we think should be the lodestar, so to speak, for data sharing. We do want to maximize the benefits of data sharing, minimize the risks. We always want to focus on participants and respect them, because after all, it's their data that's being used. We want to increase public trust in clinical trials and the sharing of trial data. It's absolutely essential that the public continue to be willing and actually increase their willingness to participate in clinical trials for the benefit of future patients. And finally, we need to conduct data sharing in a fair manner. We'll come back to that, particularly with regard to how we take into account the interests of different stakeholders. Now, there are multiple stakeholders in clinical trials, and we took a very careful look at their interests and concerns. And our general approach is that we need to be able to balance these conflicting or countervailing interests and concerns, because we need everybody in the clinical trials ecosystem to be supportive of data sharing. So first and foremost, we want to protect participants. We recognize that clinical trialists, the scientists who often spend years designing a trial, getting approval, implementing it, collect the data, they want to be able to analyze the data, publish the data, and get credit both for their work and for sharing data with others if that is what happens. Other investigators, independent investigators, want access to that data to carry out either analyses that were not done or additional analyses, and be able to try and reproduce findings using alternative valid scientific methods. As a society, as patients, we have a strong interest in making sure that the risk of invalid secondary analyses are reduced. We don't want people taking a data set and analyzing it in ways that are statistically invalid. Drug company sponsors have a strong interest in protecting their intellectual property and commercially confidential information. If they're going to continue to invest in new products to carry out clinical trials, it's a long, expensive process. They say they need some assurance that some other company won't take advantage of their data to gain unfair competitive advantage. So we had a vision for data sharing, and the main point is that we think data sharing should advance the science that's the foundation of medical care. We envisage a culture of sharing with effective incentives and protection. In this new culture, it will be the expected norm that data are shared. We call for multiple interoperative platforms with different models of data sharing, and in the Q&A we may get to more detail about what are some of the characteristics of platforms we envisage. We call for the identification of best practices for data sharing. People are doing it in a lot of different ways. Let's find out what works, what doesn't, how it can be improved. And we want the way we share data to be continuously modified and improved, and to have that process of change be driven by data, by evidence. That means we have to collect data as we share the clinical trial data. And finally, to make this all feasible, there needs to be a funding model for sharing clinical trial data that is sustainable and equitable. Big tasks, big challenges. We could not address them, but we could at least point to a path forward. Now, our first recommendation had to do with stakeholder responsibilities. And we actually make very specific recommendations for different stakeholders. I'll go through it on the next slide. These stakeholders should foster a culture in which data sharing is the expected norm. Big change from today. Funders and sponsors should require data sharing of the recipients of funding for clinical trials. They should also provide appropriate support for the data share. Investigators should share data, as we recommend in the report. Medical journals, we recommend, should require, with manuscript submissions and publications, that the authors promise to share the analytic data set that supports the public's results of the trial. So when you publish something in the medical journal, the scientific process works by having other people examine the results, whether they're backed up by the data, reanalyze it, do it alternative ways. And that back and forth discussion, which can be quite spirited, is how science progresses, and sometimes it zigs and zags. The key to that is to share with your other scientists that portion of the data set that you use to derive the figures, tables, and results. Universities, research institutions should require their employees and staff to share data in accordance with our recommendations, and they should consider your record in data sharing when it comes to hiring and promotions. Disease advocacy organizations, patient organizations, are now playing a more important role in clinical trials. They often decide whether to support a clinical trial financially or encourage their constituents to enroll in the trial. We think that first, these organizations should educate participants about what clinical trial data sharing is, what the benefits, risks are, how it can help them, and also consider data sharing when deciding whether to support a trial or not. Regulatory agencies, we also gave rules. I'm going to skip that in the interest of time, so I want to give you time for questions. Institutional review boards that review a clinical trial and improve it, we think also play a role. In their review of clinical trials, they should consider the data sharing plan as a potential benefit to the participants. They should provide guidance to investigators and actual templates for an informed consent process to sort of strengthen the discussion between investigators and participants about data sharing. And they should adopt the protections that we lay out here in our report for protecting participants when data are shared. Our second recommendation gets at what data, what specific types of data should be shared when in a clinical trial. And sponsors and investigators should share the various types of data we specify no later than the times we recommend. And I'll get into that in a little more detail. I next want to just walk you through very quickly sort of the timeline of a clinical trial and focus your attention on several milestones. The first, number one, is the design and the registration of a clinical trial. We think some information should be shared then, and we'll go into that. When you start to enroll participants is the second major milestone. When the study is completed or terminated is the third. The fourth is a publication of the results of a trial. And then we have a branch point depending on whether the trial information are going to be submitted to a regulatory agency in support of a new product or new indication. And whether it is or isn't leads to different recommendations in our report as to when certain data are shared. So let me just take a number of these and walk through them. Trial design and registration. Before you enroll patients, already now there's a requirement that the registration elements, the protocol, the research question, things like that, are put, this is actually publicly shared on something like clinicaltrials.gov. We recommend, in addition to all that, the data sharing plan, what the investigator and sponsors plan to do with data sharing, that needs to be declared in advance. The next big milestone is the completion of the study or termination of the study. Now, again, I said that much data from clinical trials are never analyzed and published, and we think that's a real loss. So 12 months after study completion, already the regulations, it's required that summary level results be posted on a public website. That there is a move afoot to broaden the scope of clinical trials that need to do that. We also call for lay language summaries of the results of a clinical trial to be distributed both to the public, but especially to the participants in the trial. We heard very eloquent testimony from clinical trial participants that they enrolled in a trial, underwent the study procedures, and never found out what the investigators found. And we think they need to know what their contributions led to in terms of scientific knowledge. The next milestone is publication. Publication in a peer-reviewed journal is sort of how scientists put their clinical trial results up for scrutiny. We think that the analytic data set, a subset of the data, that subset that backs up that you use to derive your findings, tables and figures, that needs to be shared with other investigators, in addition to metadata, full protocol and stuff. The time point is controversial. We settled on 6 months as sort of a starting point now, but we said in the report that we envisage that in the future to be shortened to simultaneous with publication, because we think that gives the scientific back and forth, the scrutiny, the discussion, to be most vigorous. And that's how we think the new knowledge will accumulate and we have a better idea of the weight of the evidence. The next milestone is whether or not you apply for regulatory approval. If you don't, and so most NIH studies, most investigator-initiated studies at universities are not submitted for a new product. But we think the full analyzable data set, the locked, clean data set, should be shared along with the protocol, analysis plan, code, metadata. 18 months after study completion. We think that gives the investigators a chance to publish, analyze the data, publish their studies, start on additional analyses. But because some investigators don't do that in a timely fashion, we want to sort of give others the opportunity to gain knowledge and publish it from that data set. Now, if it's the other arm, where the trial is being used to support a regulatory application, we have a different time point. We think that 30 days after a product is approved by the regulatory authorities, that full analyzable data set, which includes clinical study reports, which can be massive, should be shared. However, if if the regulatory agency does not approve the study, but actually not approve the product, but actually says we need more data or whatever, we think the sponsor need not share until approval or abandonment of the product or the new indication, and a decision that's also not to transfer to another company or sponsor the rights to develop the product. We think it's important there be a pipeline for new products, because I think the public, patients, clamor for more drugs, particularly for conditions where there now are not effective treatments. Our third recommendation deals with whom are the data shared and under what conditions. The holders of clinical trial data, and by holders we mean an organization that has physical control of the clinical trial data and has the legal authority to share it with others. It may be the sponsor, maybe an investigator, or maybe a third party the sponsor has agreed with to be a neutral party to disseminate the data. We believe that data use agreements should be employed. We think they can serve some very important purposes in terms of reducing the risks of data sharing. We think that there are provisions in data use agreements that can enhance the scientific value of secondary analyses. And we think provisions in data sharing can also protect the public health. We believe that if a sponsor or a clinical trial organization decides to share data, they should use an independent review panel to adjudicate requests for the data. And that panel should include members of the public. So it shouldn't be the company alone, or the principal investigators alone deciding who gets access and who doesn't. It should be an independent, neutral party. There needs to be transparency. The data sharing policies and procedures by a sponsor need to be made public. And we also call for learning from experience. That we think that if organizations that share data, clinical trial data, need to collect evidence on the outcomes of their policies, the outcomes of sharing, and transmit that new information and the lessons learned to others who are sharing data. And that way, we can keep improving how we do the data sharing. Now, we realized that at this time, no individual, no committee could, at this point, at a given point in time, settle all the issues that need to be settled with regard to clinical trial data sharing. There are a lot of issues that need to be worked out. We provided guiding principles, sort of broad recommendations, but there are a lot of details that need to be worked out and need to be worked out by the stakeholders, by the people doing it. So we said that stakeholders, in addition to doing all the things we said we recommended in recommendation 1, need to work together collaboratively on the key challenges towards this vision of data sharing that we proposed. Now, what are some of those challenges? Infrastructure. Currently, we have insufficient platforms to share and manage data. So if someone says, I'm willing to share data, what do they do with it? How do they store it? How do they share it? Technological challenges. The current platforms are not discoverable. It's hard to sort of be able to tell all the data from clinical trials on a certain class of drugs or on a certain condition. It's hard to search, and they're interoperable. They're not interoperable. So that one company may have a way of storing the data, organizing it, that's not compatible with how another company does it. And if you want to compare two different trials, that's a real headache. Workforce. There aren't enough people who are skilled, have the skills and knowledge to manage the operational technical aspects of clinical trial data sharing. And then sustainability. Currently, a small subset of sponsors and funders and trialists bear the full cost of clinical trial data sharing. And frankly, several of the large pharmaceutical companies have started doing clinical trial data sharing, and they're underwriting the costs. That's not a sustainable model. It's also not a fair model. That we recommend that those who benefit from sharing clinical trial data should also bear a fair share of the costs. And how that is going to be worked out is something that needs to be done in the future. So our fourth recommendation is, going forward, all the stakeholders need to work together to address these key challenges toward a vision of data sharing. So we said that the sponsors of this study, for example, 23 of them, both industry, government, and private and nonprofit foundations, should take the lead in conjunction with a trusted, impartial organization to convene a multi-stakeholder body that has global reach, broad representation to address these challenges in an ongoing fashion. So let me just stop there, thank the committee, thank the sponsors, call your attention to the availability right now. I guess you could download the full PDF of the report, freely distributed. Thank again our staff. And now we're open for questions and comments, both those of you in the room and on the web. If you do have a question, we ask you to please identify yourself and your affiliation.
And we did get some feedback that folks were having a hard time looking for the report online. For those of you watching via the web, there's no direct link to the report on the webcast page. You'll have to go to the iom.edu/data sharing page in order to download a copy of the report.
And it's free.
It's free.
Great.
And other materials, yeah. So with that, if anybody in the room has any questions, if you can please go to a mic so those on the web can hear you.
Joel Coopersmith. I'm now at Georgetown, and for 8 years I ran the VA Medical Research Program. I think it's an excellent report. It's a hugely important issue. And I just have a couple of quick sort of questions and comments. One is, you implied that you would be also collecting negative trials from data from negative trials. I think that's extremely important. Since you're starting at the beginning, some of the trials will be negative. And I think that's a very important issue. That data needs to be out there. Secondly, since I dealt with government firewalls, you will be, people who want to share data will be dealing with government firewalls, and there's a lot of issues related to that. I know when I was in the VA, we dealt a lot with that. And I think as you elaborate on this, you need to get some input on that, whatever the next steps will be, perhaps, or however that's going to be done, and particularly from the VA, which has a treasure trove of data. I think probably as good data as anywhere. And another issue, of course, is privacy with individual data, which you can't protect perfectly. I think that the other big data area that we think about in sharing is, of course, clinical data and data derived from electronic health records and all that sort of thing. Someday, the clinical trials and that data are going to have to be thought of in the same kind of frame of mind, because that's kind of the new phase 4, I would say, and I think there are a lot of issues related to that, but I think that has to be put together somewhere, not just considered separately. I know the IOM is very interested in that also. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to ask some of my colleagues here. Devin, do you want to talk about the privacy with particular regard to data collected in the course of clinical care that's then used for a trial?
Yeah, well, both in terms of the data collected in the course of clinical care, as well as data that would be collected as part of a clinical trial, which was really our remit to study, although I think your point is well taken. You know, we looked very carefully at this, because this is obviously going to be of great concern to participants in terms of, you know, their willingness to sign up to be in a clinical trial, and understanding that there's going to be subsequent data sharing, and what are we doing to protect that data from misuse or inadvertent exposure. De-identification of data is the tool that's most commonly used today when data are shared for secondary analysis. And we looked very carefully at what the state of de-identification was. We actually hired some experts to write a paper for us on this topic, and it's included in the appendix to the report. And it was very informative to our deliberations, and ultimately we concluded that, you know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that de-identification methodologies remain very robust. And we have something to say about that in the report, but we also acknowledge that it's far from perfect. And that there need to be potentially other measures that would need to be taken to protect the data, because ultimately the re-identification risk is about context, right? If you're talking about a data sharing model where the data are downloadable, with the possibility to combine with other data sets, you've potentially ratcheted up your re-identification risk there. And so how much you need to de-identify the data is going to depend on the other protections that you might be able to put in place. The data sharing agreement that Dr. Lowe referred to is also important, getting people to commit up front not to re-identify the data. So it's really a same set of issues, but we've got some conclusions in the report that are aimed toward reducing the risk of re-identification specifically.
Well, I'd like to move on, if I may, because we have a lot of people, but afterwards I think we can have a discussion. This discussion does not end today. This is the beginning.
So this is a question from the web. They said, for some of the commercially available databases we work with, particularly health insurance claims data, we have a strict data use agreement that prohibits sharing the data with third parties, except under some very specific additional contractual arrangements. How will we reconcile this limitation with the requirement by journals that make an analytical data set available?
Yeah, so one of the things that we do talk about is for data that's already been collected, as opposed to prospective trials, the holders of that data or anybody who's in a position to be able to release it or who might be required to release it is going to have to go back to the commitments that they made to the trial participants, or maybe other commitments that they might be legally bound to in terms of whether or not they can share data. These recommendations work very well for prospective trials. There may be pieces of it that can't be implemented retrospectively for trial data that's already been collected, but we also encourage, again, all the stakeholders to evaluate the extent to which they can share even the data that they have already collected, and they would need to look at those issues individually. But we acknowledge that there might have been some circumstances for pre-collected data.
Yes, I'm Peggy Eastman with Oncology Times newspaper, and this question goes to journals, journal publication, which is traditionally the accepted way of getting your data out there. Oftentimes there's a lag with journal publication. I know that sometimes they do online publications first, but here you've called for publishing or making available to trial participants and other data no later than 12 months after study completion. So I'm wondering how that affects an actual journal publication. Will journals even be interested in publishing some of these articles if some of the data have already gotten out there?
Okay, so Ida, do you want to handle this one? Dr. Sen?
There are already existing recommendations and guidelines for the release of summary-level data from trials 12 months after study completion. And journals need to be part of the whole culture of data sharing, that there are multiple ways for data to come out into the public domain, that all those multiple avenues separately contribute to a more vibrant research ecosystem for clinical trials. And what we're proposing here is that if an investigator chooses to publish, that the individual patient-level data, so that's more than the summary-level data, be released 6 months after publication of that study, whenever that may be, whether it was before the 12 months, when the summary data needs to be released, or before the 18 months when the individual patient data from the whole study needs to be released. So that's something, in some sense, under the control of the investigator. If they choose to make a public claim about the findings of their study, then it's part and parcel the obligation to also share that data so that we can all make the best use out of it. So I think those are complementary recommendations with existing policies.
I think, again, I just want to clarify that the most clear requirement is to share a summary of the results of the data 12 months after the conclusion of a trial. So sharing the results is different than sharing the data underlying the results. Next question.
Well, we just had a couple questions on the web asking if they can get a copy of the slides, and the slides will be posted on the website www.iom.edu/data sharing the next day or so, so you can download a copy from there. But those are the only other questions we had from the web, sir. I don't know if you had a follow-up question to your earlier question you'd like to ask.
Thank you. All I was going to say is that I think the public needs to be aware that privacy protection is never going to be perfect. And that's, I think, would be very helpful in this whole realm.
We do mention that in the report. You'll see there's also a section about sort of making clear with participants that the data are going to be shared. There's a discussion about consent to the subsequent sharing, and in that language we talk about how people need to understand that while there will be measures taken to protect the anonymity of the data, that there are not absolute guarantees about that. I mean, ultimately, we really try, acknowledging that what was really beneficial for participants in these trials was the ability to maximize the value of their contributions through subsequent sharing. But of course, acknowledging that we've got these concerns, and what do we do to address them while still making sure that sharing can occur?
I just want to ask Sharon Terry to say something about the attitudes and perspectives of participants with regard to data sharing, because it's not monolithic and it's quite nuanced and complicated.
Yes, yeah. In fact, Dr. Alan Weston, when he did a report for the IOM several years ago, showed a beautiful bell curve that we should expect that people are pretty much not uniform at all in their understanding of their own desires to share data. And what we've found subsequently through Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and other studies is that people feel feel very differently about different information in different contexts, and that there are actually emerging technologies, experiences, and tools that are allowing individuals to make decisions in a granular and dynamic way around health information. So I think the public has not been completely naive on this issue. I think in some sense we've tried to treat them in a monolithic way and tried to put one size fits all and sometimes over-assure them and sometimes under-assure them when in fact we really do need to be more granular, and we do go into detail in the report about these issues.
We have a question in the room, please.
Hi, this is Kristen Cox with Kristen Cox Santiago with Sea Change, and we are looking at the issue of big data this year and really bringing together all the players in the big data space to discuss some of the barriers and identify opportunities for Sea Change to take on. So I'm just curious, of the 4 challenges that were listed, if there's one that you all feel maybe is the most pressing. It was infrastructure, technology, workforce, and sustainability. And then if they're applicable to the clinical trial data, but if one might stand out more when you're looking at other data types as well.
Ida, do you want to take it, and then Devin? We actually may have some disagreement.
Right.
The ranking, but they're all important. Ida, you want to start?
Yeah, I think it's hard to pull one out as being the biggest challenge. I think the thing to note about this area is that all the challenges dovetail on all the other challenges, and I think we think the most effective way to move forward is to take them on together, which seems daunting, but to solve them individually actually might lead to greater problems. So I wouldn't pull any one out of them. I'll address specifically the technical infrastructure issue because that is definitely a big challenge. And the committee recommends sort of an infrastructure model that we call the federated query model. It's one that I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And in this model, data is held by independent, separate data holders. And the queries, data requests, go to the separate data holders, right? The queries are routed to the different databases. And to the querier, it looks like the data is in one virtual database. And what happens then is you can layer on top of that distributed query policies on data access, protections for de-identification, the issue of firewalls that was mentioned earlier. Technically, that can be accommodated, and the policies that govern data requests and data access can be layered on top of that. The good news is that, technically we can do that, but the challenge is how to do it at the least expense and the greatest effectiveness, and that's where workforce comes in, that's where sustainability comes in, that's where policy comes in, that's where expectations come in. So we really can't tease them apart. It's a socio-technical challenge, clinical trial data sharing, and I think the committee, wants to put forth that the further work in this area does need to take sort of a broad, coherent view of all the challenges that interlock together.
Okay, so we have a number of questions from our internet listeners, and so I wanted to ask that we keep both the questions and the responses short to get to as many questions. Just be eloquent, but be concise.
Our next question asks, how do you envision getting pharma sponsors to share clinical trial data if they decide not to advance a particular therapy?
Joanne Waldstreicher, are you on the line?
Yes, I am on the line, and I actually think that the sponsors, and not just in industry, but in all clinical trials, and this point was brought up before, really are encouraged to share their clinical trial data, whether or not the studies are positive or negative, and whether or not they ultimately go forward with their products and make decisions to continue the development of the product, or if they stop their development and don't go forward. I think we all now, with a healthy R&D ecosystem, I think people are moving forward and understanding the importance of all of those different types of data and sharing those data broadly.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Our next question is, what if patients refuse to downstream data sharing?
Devin?
So we talk a bit about this in the report and note that there may very well be circumstances, particularly among populations that are suspicious about clinical trials generally, much less subsequent sharing, that they may want to be able to say yes to the trial and no to the subsequent sharing, and a lot of concerns about whether that makes too many changes in the data set and would skew the science. And ultimately, we call for additional study of this issue because we didn't want to say, no, people should be forced to share if they're getting in a clinical trial. On the other hand, we recognize the issues that allowing people to opt out of the subsequent sharing would provide. It is an area that really needs some additional work.
Another question from the internet?
Yes, are new regulations needed to ensure the data sharing actually happens?
Sharon, you smiled.
So I don't know that I would say new regulations are needed yet, because I think our fourth recommendation is a very important one, which says we really need to convene ourselves as all stakeholders, just like my colleagues were saying. We really need to have this be a multifaceted effort. I think we also need to look at what is the evidence. Do we need more evidence before we make decisions around regulation, for example? What is the work that each of the stakeholders can do? And we named some very concrete, immediately actionable items. And if we did those things, would we have the ecosystem that Joanne was just talking about so that data sharing could happen?
We do, though, say that they should issue clear guidance that the sharing is expected. And so they're called out as a stakeholder with responsibilities here. Take a look at the regs. Take a look at the guidance that you've issued. Does it support what we recommend?
Okay.
And we have just one more question so far from the web. How will privacy be protected, meaning how will you be able to enforce violations? And can you also elaborate on the role of universities?
Why don't we split that and give Devin the privacy? And Joanne, do you want to take universities?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so on the privacy issue, one of the reasons why we call for data sharing agreements that place some restrictions on the circumstances under which people can obtain data that's being shared after a clinical trial is to obtain the commitments that people will not re-identify participants and will use the data in the way that they have proposed and in no other way. They are not perfect vehicles for accountability. But they are something, and we believe that that notwithstanding that they may or may not be enforceable depending on your jurisdiction, they create a norm that this is what's expected of you. I think there's probably some subsequent work that would need to be done to shore up accountability in the long term, and there may be some role the regulators can play here. But that's, ultimately we recognize that this was an important issue to take account of, and we've at least put some some starter measures on the table for that.
Okay, and the second part of that question, as I recall, had to do with the role of universities.
Yeah, this
Dr.
is
Walstreicher,
Joanne.
do you want to?
We as a committee recognized that it's so critical that we advance the science, which is really the foundation of medical care. And research institutions and universities play a tremendous role in that science and the scientific rigor and in the studies that they do. So we really call down universities to ensure that investigators from their institution share the data from their clinical trials in accordance with our recommendations, so that they really are also at the forefront of this culture change that we're trying to build. Also that they promote the development of sustainable infrastructures and mechanisms, that they make sharing of clinical trial data even a consideration of faculty members who are looking for promotion, and also that they provide training for data science and quantitative sciences scientists who could facilitate sharing and analysis of clinical trial data.
Okay, and could I ask Dr. Sim, who's a professor at a leading research university, to talk a little about maybe the changes that will need to take place in the culture of academic medicine?
Concisely. We do need a culture change. I think that from my perspective at UCSF, I think some of the newer investigators are coming in already, sharing a culture of data sharing. Those of us who've been around a little longer, this is a little bit new. And I think it's going to take a time of transition, but it does come from a change of culture to enable all the things that Dr. Walstreicher recommended, the infrastructure, the workforce training, the promotions, that starts with a culture change. I do believe it's starting, and our report is an attempt to move that along.
So with that, I wanted to thank those of you, I want to thank those of you who attended, either in person or on the web, And again, my thanks to the committee and staff, but also the 3 colleagues in the room and the 4th on the web for being here and being willing to answer questions. As I said before, this isn't the beginning, not the end of the discussion. We encourage you to continue this discussion of the issues in your institutions and the convening activities that you participate in. Thank you very much.